Welcome to All Those Kings, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Today we're going to start with King Solomon, and I'm going to present an image of Solomon that may be at variance with the way the church has regarded him for the last several centuries, but a critical reading of the text indicates that perhaps Solomon was not the man that the church has presented to us. As a quick review, I wanted to talk about last time. We had David, who was bedridden, ill, was unable to keep himself warm, to the point that they brought a young girl in named Abishag, who stayed in bed with him to provide body heat. And the Bible makes it very clear that she was not having sexual relations with him. She was simply a nurse, in effect. And because he was infirm and unable to rule effectively, one of his sons, Adoniah, and incidentally, Adonijah is pronounced in Hebrew as Adoniah. Many times when they're brought over into English, we mispronounce them. Solomon is Shlomo, but we get Solomon because of the way they rendered the letters and the vowels. But because of his infirmity, Adonijah attempted to co-opt the throne from his rivals, including his younger brother Solomon, who was a half-brother. This was discovered. David was informed of what was happening, and he took steps to immediately confirm and anoint Solomon as king, put him on the throne, and Adonijah and the people that were supporting him were panicked. Obviously, they were engaged in what could be regarded as treasonable activities. They certainly were exposed as supporters of Adonijah, and Adonijah's support disappeared. He fled to the tent in which the ark was kept, took the horns of the altar to plead sanctuary, and was reassured by Solomon that he could return home as long as he didn't engage in any other seditious activities. So that's where we ended last week. David was still alive. Solomon was king. And it says here, as you can see in the text, Adonijah, in fear of Solomon, went and took hold of the horns of the altar. This is a practice that goes back through all of the cultures of the ancient world. We don't exactly know why that happened, but we do know that the little prongs that stick up off the corners of the altar, called the horns of the altar, were a mechanism by which people could claim sanctuary. Until they could be judged by an appropriate group of priests or kings or whatever, and then their particular crimes could be settled. It goes on to say that when the time drew near for David to die, he gave a charge to Solomon. We don't know how long this was. It was probably not too long after Solomon became king. David continued his decline. He knew his end was approaching, and he called Solomon in and said, I have some things I want to tell you. And this charge that he gave Solomon included, first of all, some advice as to how to be an effective, moral, good king, follow the laws of the Lord, think of your people, be a good king. And then he finished up with several orders which Solomon was to obey, basically to avenge David. Slights that he had experienced in his life, he wanted Solomon to take care of. And I'm going to mention a couple of those. One of those is dealing with Joab. Joab was his nephew. It was the son of his mother's sister, David's mother's sister. So it was a nephew. We don't know whether he was older or younger. They were probably of an age. And Joab had been his top general for 40 years. And yet, way back when, almost 40 years earlier, he had killed Abner, Abner being the top general for Ishbosheth. Now, Joab and Abner and David, they were all certainly living together in Saul's palace at the time of Saul's kingship when David was young. But Abner would have been older. He would have been a top general. David knew him. And after Saul died, Abner had come down to David and said, maybe we can work out a deal. I can bring the northern tribes to you. In effect, he was in Hebron under a white flag. And as he was leaving, Joab had just returned from being out in the field, and Joab's brother and Abner had had a set-to earlier on, and Abner had killed Joab's brother. So when Joab saw Abner, without any warning whatsoever, he killed him. And then much later, almost 40 years later, Amasa, who was a cousin to they were all half-brothers, half-cousins, and whatnot. Amasa was one of the top officers in David's army, who was a competitor and a rival to Joab. And Joab, again, thinking that he'd been slighted, killed Amasa without warning. And so David said, you know what he did? He killed these two, Abner and Amasa, without warning. And David regarded that as a blood debt to himself because he'd been in charge. And he points out that Joab killed these two. They were innocent, and in peacetime, and without warning, he killed them both. So I would like you to settle the score. And he says, as far as Joab, do not let his gray head go down to the grave in peace. In other words, don't let that old guy die in bed. I want you to do him in. At that point, David died, and it said he rested with his fathers, was buried in the city of David, and I showed you pictures of the tomb last week. He had reigned 40 years over Israel, a combined 40 years, 7 years in Hebron, 2 years in Hebron with Ishbosheth up north, and then the next 5 years, a combined rule from Hebron, and then he moved his capital to Jerusalem for the next 33. And Solomon sat on the throne of his father David, and his rule was firmly established. Now, I'm going to take a look at how firmly it was established. It was brutally and ruthlessly established, frankly. I'm going to make an editorial comment about Solomon. I have been curious, bemused, actually, about the respect and almost adoration that the church has afforded to Solomon over the centuries. He is presented to us. In fact, if I were to ask for a show of hands as to who was one of the greatest of the kings, I think most of you would probably conclude that Solomon certainly belongs in that list. But in point of fact, he doesn't deserve that kind of respect. He took the throne ruthlessly. He did build the temple, but that wasn't even his doing. David bought the land, he bought the materials, he got the plans. They were inspired to him. He arranged for the contractors. All Solomon did was put things in play, so he really doesn't deserve a whole lot of credit for that. And from then on, he was a ruthless tyrant. And if you read the Bible critically, you'll find out that he was such a ruthless tyrant that when he died, most of the people in his reign rejected his son as king, and at the end of his reign, he actually betrayed the Lord in the worst possible way by becoming a worshiper of pagan gods. He built pagan idols on the Temple Mount where he actually built the temple, and he worshipped Moloch and Chemosh, and he had a bunch of pagan wives and built altars for them as well. He betrayed the Lord, and the upshot of all of that is that eventually Israel was destroyed by the Assyrians and the Babylonians as a direct consequence of Solomon's betrayal. Saul betrayed the Lord by refusing to follow a couple of orders, a relatively minor infraction, in my opinion. David committed a couple of capital crimes. He committed murder and adultery, but he repented. He never betrayed his faith. But Solomon, who had been approached twice by God, and he makes that clear in the text, at the end of his life had abandoned his faith and become a pagan worshiper. So keep that in mind as we talk through these things, and you have to question a little bit why this is so completely downplayed by the church over the years and why they present Solomon to us as the ideal king. Yes?
Don't you think it's because he wrote Proverbs, or it's attributed to him that he did?
The question was, is it perhaps because of his writings? And that very well may be. But at the end of his life, again, it was a total betrayal of the Lord. And because of that, Israel was destroyed. So I've always been confused and curious as to...
It was his wife's fault.
It was his wife. Which wife? He had 700. Okay. Well, on that note, let's let's move ahead. The first thing that happened that we are confronted with is Adonijah went to Bathsheba. Now, Bathsheba she's not a stepmother. Well, I guess she's technically a stepmother. She's the mother of his half-brother, and I'm not sure how that plays out. But he went to Bathsheba, and he said, I had to give up. I thought I was king, but I'm not. Your son is king. I have a small favor that I would like you to ask of Solomon. Let Abishag be given in marriage to your brother Adonijah. This is what he wanted her to ask. Go and say, would you give Abishag to Adonijah? Now, Abishag was the young girl who had been nursing David at the very end of his life. And this seems like a fairly benign request, wouldn't you think? He wants a pretty young wife. And Solomon erupted in fury and said to his mother, you might as well request the kingdom for him. After all, he's my older brother. And then he turns and says, swearing by the Lord, Adonijah shall be put to death today. And he gave orders to Benaiah, who is Benaiah is going to become his top general at this point. And Benaiah went and struck down Adonijah, and he died. Now the question is, why? What was so impressive about asking for Abishag? This is where you have to understand the culture of the day. The harem, the concubines, and the wives were not so much a possession of the king as a possession of the throne and the kingship. And the man who inherited the concubines and the wives was demonstrated as the appropriate heir to the throne. Abishag may or may not have been a concubine. She hadn't actually had physical relations with David, but she would be regarded, first of all, as a concubine. And Adonijah is an older brother, in fact, higher up in the hierarchy as to the throne, and so he could present himself to the populace as the appropriate king, and not Solomon, and all of his followers might come back to him, foment rebellion, and Solomon could lose the throne. Solomon knew this. This was just another sneaky attempt by Adonijah to co-opt the throne, and he said, I'm not going to put up with it anymore, and he sent Benaiah out and immediately had Adonijah executed, firmly establishing his claim to the throne. Joab, at this point, who had been David's general for 40 years, heard that Adonijah had been executed, and he had conspired with Adonijah. Remember at that big banquet, Joab was down there celebrating with Adonijah, trying to cement his claim to the army so that when Adonijah became king, he could keep his position. And he was afraid that Solomon was going to take revenge on him, and as it turns out, that's what happened. It went to the tent of the Lord, which is where the ark was included, and the altar, which would either have been outside this small tent or possibly inside, although that's where you burned offerings, so probably the altar was just adjacent to the tent. He took a hold of the horns for sanctuary. He knew that Benaiah would be coming for him. He fled to the tent of the Lord. Now, when Solomon was told that Joab had fled to the tent of the Lord and was beside the altar, he said to Benaiah, go, strike him down. He's over there in the tent, go kill him. Well, Benaiah entered the tent, and there's Joab hanging on to the horns of the altar. This is sanctified land. This is where God lives, right there by the ark. And he says, come on out. And Joab said, no, I'm not coming out. He said, I'll die here. If you want to kill me, you're going to have to kill me in here. And Benaiah refused to do that. He recognized that this is sanctified land. He went back to the king and said, here's what Joab said. He said he's not coming out. So what did Solomon say? Solomon said, I don't care. Go into the tent and strike him down and clear me and my father's house of the guilt of innocent blood that Joab shed. I don't care that he's in sanctified territory, that he's claiming sanctuary, which is inviolate. Go kill him anyway. And that's exactly what Benaiah did. He entered the tent of the Lord, struck down Joab, and killed him. In other words, violating centuries of tradition, violating the sanctity of the tent where the ark was contained. And what was Benaiah's reward? Well, Benaiah took over Joab's position and became the top general in Solomon's army. So 2 examples right off the bat of the brutality and the ruthlessness with which Solomon took the throne. And it says the kingdom was now firmly in Solomon's hands. He's kind of cleared the board, gotten rid of his rivals. And at the next step that we read about, he went to Gibeon to offer sacrifices, for that was the most important high place. And at Gibeon the Lord appeared to Solomon during the night in a dream. There was no temple in Jerusalem. That had not been built yet. There was an altar up at Mount Moriah to the north of the city on the threshing floor of Araunah. But apparently the priesthood had gone to Gibeon. That's about 6 or 7 miles north of Jerusalem on a little mound. They've excavated it. And he went up there to make offerings to the Lord. And it was here that the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream. Now remember what the Lord told Miriam and Aaron way back at the time of Moses in the Exodus. He pointed out that to prophets he appears in dreams, God does, and in visions, but to Moses he appeared face to face. Moses was his special person. Solomon is not one of his special people. He's appearing to Solomon in a dream, which is the way he appeared to nearly everybody else in the Bible. And he said, ask for what you want, and it shall be given to you. Solomon responded, O Lord, my God. And incidentally, O Lord, that L-O-R-D, capital letters, that is the personal name of God in the Bible. That's the Tetragrammaton. Those 4 letters have been rendered in our English Bibles as Lord with capital letters. But in Hebrew, if you bring those letters through and try to arrange them and stick some vowels in so that we can read it in English, it's been rendered as Yahweh. Or if you do the German version, it's Jehovah. So anytime you see those 4 capital letters, that's either Yahweh or Jehovah, and you can get a Bible that shows all of those renderings as Yahweh or Jehovah in the Bible. And if you read it as God's name rather than the word Lord, then it gives a slightly different perspective to the passages. And so I recommend that you try that sometime. He's calling God by name. Capital L, small O-R-D means master or leader or ruler. But capital Lord is Jehovah. So he's saying, O Yahweh, my God, I am only a little child and do not know how to carry out my duties. And this raises the question, how old was he? Well, he wasn't a child. There are scholars who will argue that because of that passage, he's a little child, but judging from his behavior and the way he took control of the kingdom, he has to be an adult, an experienced adult. He has to have been preparing for his kingship, and I would argue that he was in his young 20s, perhaps. And most scholars would agree with that, although there are a few that would say he's only 6 or 7, 8 years old. He really is a little child. What that passage ought to be interpreted as probably is, I am childlike in my understanding of how to rule. Please help me in my initial stages of kingship. So anyway, what he says is to God, give your servant, meaning give me, a discerning heart to govern your people and distinguish between right and wrong. And God is so pleased with this request, he gave Solomon what he had asked for. It was such a modest request. In fact, he was so impressed, he said, I'll give you a wise and discerning heart so there will never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever be. And this is the passage by which the church has represented Solomon, I think, for the last 2,000 years. And not only that, because you asked for such a modest thing, I'm going to give you riches and honor that you didn't ask for, so that in your lifetime you will have no equal among the kings. And that's indeed what happened. He was one of the richest, most famous of the kings of his time. And we are given 2 examples of his wisdom. I like this one. We have two prostitutes sleeping side by side who had given birth within a couple of days of each other, and one rolled over on her baby and killed him in her sleep. So she, when she woke up and saw her dead baby, she took the living baby of the one adjacent to her and swapped them out. And the other mother woke up the next morning and realized that the dead baby beside her wasn't hers, that the live baby was over there. They appealed to the king, and Solomon said, well, that's an easy thing. Cut the baby in half, and you can give half to each mother. And the mother of the living child said, please don't kill the baby. She didn't want her baby killed. And he recognized that she was indeed the legitimate mother. And everybody acknowledged that as a remarkable decision and a sign of wisdom. This became a feature of Christian art. This is a Rubens from the 1600s called the Judgment of Solomon. You can see the two mothers there in their European ball gowns. And the baby about to be killed, the dead baby on the ground. And, of course, religious art was for illiterate people in the churches, people who couldn't read the text. It was in Latin, whatever they were told by the priests, and they were illiterate themselves, couldn't read the text, and so they could see the various stories illustrated. So you see a lot of this type of thing. And then we're told about the Queen of Sheba. She came from what has, at this point, been determined to be Yemen. Nobody really knows, but she came from someplace down in that region. And it says that when she heard about the fame of Solomon and his relation to the name of Yahweh, she came to test him with hard questions, and we're told that he answered all her questions. Nothing was too hard for the king to explain to her. And she was so impressed that she gave him tremendous wealth. 120 talents of gold, that's a weight of gold. That's a huge amount of gold. Large quantities of spices, which were quite valuable in those days, and precious stones. And that, too, was memorialized in art. Here you have the modest little palace of Solomon with the Queen of Sheba. A lot of the art was done by people who had never been to the Holy Land. They didn't know what the buildings looked like. They didn't know what the clothing looked like. They give European buildings and trees and all kinds of things that you might see in England, but not in the Holy Land. So anyway, there was the Queen of Sheba. He did build the temple, and I'll talk about that next week. But he was wise. He was blessed by God. But let's take a look. He spent 20 years building the temple of Yahweh and the royal palace. 7 of those years was for the temple, 13 years for his palace. His opulent, huge palace and administrative buildings. He built all of this up at the northern end of the city of Jerusalem. I'll show you some maps and diagrams next time. Then it goes on to say, here's the account of the forced labor. This is what alienated all of his people. He imposed such harsh taxation and forced labor that they rejected Rehoboam, and eventually the weakness of the divided kingdom was such that the Assyrians and the Babylonians were able to destroy them. They mention here the people left from the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, and the Bible points out that these weren't Israelites. These are the people that were there when they arrived during the Exodus, and were told to eliminate those people. But it points out all of those people whom the Israelites could not exterminate, Solomon conscripted for his slave labor force as it is to this day. Now, what that means is whoever was writing that, the author at that time, they were still employing these people as slave labor. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines. I disagree with that number. And I want to show you why. It was the practice of ancient cultures to exaggerate numbers that related to important people to demonstrate their importance. It was simply a magnification of their importance. If you multiplied any of their important numbers by 10, for example, that would create a much greater importance and value to the individual. Here's an example of the use of numbers. Peter came up to Jesus and said, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother? Notice incidentally, those are small letters. He's saying master, rabbi, teacher. He's not calling him Jehovah or Yahweh. He says, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother when he sins against me? Up to 7 times, which is a special symbolic number. What was Jesus' response? He said, no, not 7 times, 77 times. 7 times 10 is 70, and he added another 7 in there, 77. In other words, never stop. This is an infinite number. So the use of numbers we have to interpret sometimes, and it's not always so easy. So anyway, he had 700 wives. He had a lot of wives and a lot of concubines. Now, who are these wives and concubines? They are from the people around the kingdom of Israel who have been conquered or under the hegemony of Solomon. They're pagans. And they send their daughters, these small tribal leaders send their daughters in a ritual marriage to kind of create a family relationship. He may not have even met many of these women. You have to even question where they're kept. I mean, there's not a whole lot of room in Jerusalem, and maybe in the small towns he'd have to scatter these women all over his kingdom. But he had a harem, a large number of women who had been joined to him in some kind of a legal relationship. But the Bible tells us, if you look in Deuteronomy, it said, when the Lord your God brings you into the land you're entering to possess, and there are all of those Canaanites, all those pagans, do not intermarry with them. Why not? It says, do not give your daughters to their sons, don't take their daughters for your sons, or they will turn your sons away from following me to serve the gods. That's what he's saying. Don't interact with these Canaanites, and that's exactly what Solomon did, and it says as he turned old, his wives turned his heart after other gods. He abandoned his worship of the Lord, the God who had granted him everything, and he turned his back on him. He actually built small high places, these are small altars, on the Temple Mount where he had built God's temple. Right next to it, all of the little pagan altars. He followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Malach, the detestable god of the Ammonites. Who's Malach? He's the one that had this bronze statue of some sort with fire, and you'd throw the babies into it. He made offerings to Malach. It goes on to say, on a high hill east of Jerusalem, he built a high place for Chemosh. And that may be another name for Malach. We're not quite sure. But the detestable god of Moab, and for Malach, the detestable god of the Ammonites. All in the Moabites and the Ammonites are in the same region. So he was offering to a God that accepted human sacrifice. This is Solomon. He did the same for all his foreign wives. See, they turned his heart away. That's why Deuteronomy said, don't marry these ladies. I get a kick out of this. Here's fat old Solomon at the end of his life. He's got some of his wives and concubines in their European ball gowns, and he's burning incense. So this was a representation of the end of Solomon's life. And it says Yahweh became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from Yahweh, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. And as a result, a severe punishment was imposed upon Israel, probably because many of the people of Israel were following the lead of Solomon. You have to assume this. The Lord had appeared to him twice, and at this point the Lord said to Solomon, since you have not kept my covenant and my decrees, I will tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. And it goes on to say, and this is one of my questions. I have a whole list of questions when I get up there, not to question or criticize, but simply to ask understanding. It says, for the sake of David your father, I will not do it during your lifetime. I'll tear it out of the hand of your son. And my question is, why didn't he punish Solomon? Solomon was the sinner, but that's not ours to question at this point. But he said, I will give him, Rehoboam, I will give your son one tribe for the sake of David my servant, and for the sake of Jerusalem which I have chosen. He gives him Judah, which has Jerusalem, which has the temple. So he's keeping the most important part of the kingdom, but he gives the rest away, and it's taken over by Jeroboam. Jeroboam was a man of standing who was in charge of the whole labor force of the house of Joseph. The house of Joseph is a term that's used from the time of the Exodus. There were two sons born to Joseph down in Egypt, Manasseh and Ephraim. And when Jacob acknowledged the various sons, and then the allotments were given as they arrived in the conquest, rather than giving one allotment to the sons, to Joseph's tribe, he gave an allotment to each of the sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, and that's referred to as the house of Joseph. In other words, Joseph got a double inheritance, which was the practice in those days. The inheritance would be divided among however many sons there were. 5 sons, there'd be 5 inheritances, but they divided into 6 pieces, and 2 of those would go to the favored son. That was typically the practice, and Joseph was the favorite son. So the house of Joseph, that was Ephraim and Manasseh kind of in the middle, and Jeroboam was the guy running the labor crews for all of the various constructions that Solomon was doing. And then Ahiah, the prophet of Shiloh, met Jeroboam outside the city one day and said that the Lord was going to take the kingdom from Rehoboam and give you 10 tribes. Well, what was Jeroboam's response? He was probably delighted. Somehow Solomon heard about it and tried to kill him. It says Solomon tried to kill Jeroboam, but he fled to Egypt to Shishak the king, who shows up several years later and rampages through Judah and Israel after the kingdom's been divided. So we'll talk about him probably next time. So he fled to Egypt, and he stayed there till Solomon died. Then he came back to claim his 10 tribes, the so-called lost tribes of Israel. And we'll take a look at that next time. Solomon died. He reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel for 40 years, and then he rested with his fathers and was buried in the city of David, his father. And Rehoboam, his son, succeeded him as king, was rejected by the northern tribes. They divided, weakened themselves to the point where they could no longer defend themselves against outside forces. The Assyrians eventually conquered the northern territories, and the Babylonians eventually conquered Judah and carried the survivors of that siege off to Babylon for 50 years. So the direct result of Solomon's betrayal of the Lord is the total destruction of the territories that had been given to them in the Exodus. And so I put it out there. Was Solomon indeed the ideal king or not? And I would disagree with that assessment. So I left a little bit of time for questions. Next week we're going to talk about the temple. That is so important because that becomes the central focus of not only the faith but Judaism for the next 3,000 years. And the rebuilding of the temple today is regarded as the beginning of the end times by the Jewish faith, just as we regard the return of Christ as the beginning of the end times. So the temple is tremendously important. I want to show you what it looked like and what happened to it. We'll talk about Rehoboam the king very briefly, and the divided kingdom, and make mention of the destruction of the divided kingdom. All of those things have to be left perhaps for All Those Kings Part 2. I don't know if we'll ever get to it, but I wanted to focus on the 3 primary kings at the beginning of Israel. So I think we have a few minutes. Does anybody have any comments or questions or contradictions or challenges? Yes.
John, is that 40 years of he reigned a pretty actual 40 years, or we don't know that?
The 40 years of Solomon? The question is what about those 40 years? We know David ruled for 40 years. The Bible makes it quite clear. 7 years in Hebron, 33 years in Jerusalem. You add the 2 together, you get 40. But the Bible is full of 40s. He was a judge for 40 years. He had 40 sons and 40 daughters who rode 40 donkeys, and they had 40 houses. And the term 40 carries with it a secondary meaning, a symbolic meaning, and we don't know exactly what it is. It's about 40 years, It may be at least 40 years, or it may mean a generation or the fullness of time. He was king for 40 years means he reigned for a long time and was successful. Typically, it's associated with a successful activity. But I don't think Solomon's may have been exactly 40. I would bet it's about 40. The problem is, we know when Solomon died, and we can assign that time based upon Egyptian records and the Bible records, with Shishak, the relationship to Shishak, who in Egypt was Shishonk the first. You can even get the name there. So we know when Solomon died, and our entire Bible chronology prior to Solomon is based upon 40 years. We know that he reigned for 40 years. That means he took the throne in 970. I would argue he took the throne about 970, and then there's a passage I'll show you next time that says 4 years after he took the throne, he started building the temple. That was 480 years after the Exodus. Now, is that a real 480? Well, we don't know, but you count back to that, and it says they were in Egypt for 430 years, and that's a symbolic number, in my opinion, because there is other historical material that changes that, but you jump back another 430 years, and then you know how old Jacob was, and Isaac was, and how old Abraham was, and that entire chronology that you see in the back of your Bible is based upon accepting those numbers as real numbers. So we have the Exodus here, we have Sodom destroyed here. The problem is Dr. Steve Collins says, no, Sodom's destroyed here. We have the real city of Sodom, we have a real date for it, and we don't have this much time between Abraham and the Exodus. We only have this much time. So that means everything in the back of your Bible is wrong. But those are all calculated numbers, and for some reason the church, traditional scholars are very reluctant to say we've made a mistake all these years. We have new information. Let's recalculate things, because it makes no difference in the story. Makes no difference whatsoever. But anyway, you asked about 40. I don't think it's a real 40. It may have been. Yes, John.
I've often wondered, in those days, the king, especially as you describe him, a ruthless king, you better not approach him on anything frivolous or even personal matters. He's the king on the throne. Be careful what you ask the king. But yet Bathsheba asked him about Solomon and about his promise. I wonder what would have happened if Bathsheba had not been accepted to address him, or whether she would not have dared to bring this subject up. Would Solomon still have inherited the throne?
John's question is, what would have happened if Bathsheba hadn't come to David? Said Adonijah's down there trying to co-opt the throne. It's an interesting question, because Bathsheba apparently was still one of his favored wives. She still the palace is a tiny little building. These are not big buildings in Jerusalem in those days. So she obviously is in close proximity to a dying king, so she was favored. And she apparently had the courage to say, you promised that Solomon would become king. And if she had not done that, if you have to speculate, Adonijah would become king. He would have been acclaimed. He would have been put on the throne. He had one of the major priests in his camp. He would have been anointed. He would have been put on the throne. And as Solomon told David, as Bathsheba told David, she said, Solomon and I would be treated as criminals. He'd have killed them, just the way Adonijah had to be accounted for.
Because of this, you can understand Adonijah's viewpoint and his family's thoughts about his certainly inheriting the kingdom if it were not for Bathsheba.
Yes, Adonijah felt entitled. He was the oldest. I mean, there had been Amnon, and he was gone, and there had been Absalom, and he's gone, and now we have Adonijah, who felt entitled, and maybe he was concerned he wouldn't get the throne, so he decided to preempt it. And because David was so sick that apparently he wasn't even being told what was happening. Question.
God had a plan, I think. I mean, look at David. He was the youngest of his family, and yet God chose him.
The question was, God had a plan, and Solomon was part of that, as David was part of it, and all the way through the Bible, it's not the firstborn who is selected for the various tasks. It's always the secondborn or later. Joseph, Isaac, and you work your way down the line. Yes, question?
I mean, with the Egyptians so anxious to get rid of the Jews, and now they're, after all these years, got their own homeland, why are they running back and forth to Egypt so often? Yeah, because in this story, right, he goes back.
Oh, yes. The question is, why do the Egyptians keep playing a role in the history of these events? They went to Egypt early on because that's where food was. Archaeologically, we can now show that this was a time, that the time of the patriarchs was a time of repeated famine in the Holy Land. And so lots of Semitic people were going to Egypt. In this particular case, and for the next 300 years, Egypt is constantly dabbling in the politics of that area. They're trying to establish hegemony up through Israel because that's the corridor that contained the trade routes. Very strategic land. Meanwhile, the Assyrians are coming. They're trying to establish that, and so there's constant conflict between the Egyptians and the Assyrians. And then when the Babylonians later come, there's conflict there as well. But if you're trying to flee from Israel, if Jeroboam is trying to get out of town and go someplace, you either have to go up to the Assyrian areas or you have to go down to the Egyptian areas. You have to get out of the country because there's no place to hide. It's too small. So he went to Egypt and was treated with respect, probably because they felt they might be able to use him later on. And then as it turns out, Shishak took the opportunity to come and attack. So the geopolitics play a major role in the divided kingdom, and I'll talk about those very briefly next time. Once you understand all the different forces, you begin to get a sense of what's going on. One last question. The comment was Solomon accepted immigrants, but put the proviso that they accept the Israelite faith. And that gets into a big political, and they're trying to put that into modern times. I think I'll skip that. So, next time, last time, and I hope to see you then. Thank you.
Bible Interact, uncovering the mysteries of the kingdom of God. At BibleInteract.tv, you will penetrate the scriptures of the Bible. At our store, you're just one click away from owning your favorite books, DVDs, or study guides. Earn a degree from our university and watch hundreds of video presentations from biblical scholars, archaeologists, and theologians. By subscribing to Bible Interact, you'll find all the resources you'll need, so why not subscribe today? Go to www.BibleInteract.tv. You'll be glad you did. Interested in studying more about the temple, the Messiah, or what God's plan is for our future? No problem. We've got you covered. With more than 200 DVDs, books, and workbooks, you'll find the answers you've been searching for. Bible Interact, uncovering the mysteries of the kingdom of God.